Oh, hello everyone, and welcome to part two of my overview on the stock block rules and the question of the Penske engine at the Indy 500 in 1994. In the last episode I did on Tuesday or Wednesday, I highlighted just the history of the stock block, what it was meant to do, and who the engine was made for and who the engine probably was not made for, but was obviously taken seriously by, uh, obviously was used by a couple of people. Um, so I'm going to explain uh, what was happening at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. I'm going to continue the story, what was happening at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in 92, 93, that led to some of the changes. So as I said, in the 90s, most of the engines at Indianapolis were 2.65 liters, or you could have up to a 3.43 or a 209 cubic inch V8. Those rules in the late 90s had been updated to um, use, of course, more boost to 55 inches of boost, which was, I believe, 1.8 bar, and that was allowing the cars to make 900 to 950 plus in the Buicks and the Maynards of that era. Um, uh, and teams like True Sport um, and a couple other teams were using those engines because they wanted a cheaper way to get into the Indy 500, obviously, and those engines were made for off-the-shelf parts. It was basically like the Cosworth DFX or the Cosworth DFE or the Chevy small block, but turbocharged um, and based off the Buick V6 or the Chevrolet GM V6, the 3.8 liter, although it was sized down, based on some of the technology from the based on some of the IMSA GTP style cars, because Buick did run a 3.0 twin turbo V6 in Alba RE or RB8 Can-Am GTP / Group C cars, making about 650 horsepower, and then somebody figured, well, we can make it high power for Indy and run it at oval tracks, because I think at some point, I think racing was starting to get a little too expensive. So I think what the Indianapolis guys were thinking of doing was probably to make stock blocks a thing so that the cars could be more American, because it was an overhead valve V8 versus a dual overhead cam, kind of, because at the time there were a lot of changes that Tony George, the Holman family, wanted to make to the Indy 500. Because by the late 90s, early 2000s, because by the late 90s and late 80s, early 90s, it was starting to become more of an international affair, and guys from the open wheel dirt tracks and stuff like that weren't really the little guy who wanted to get into the field 33 was starting to get pushed out by these. Um, and there was also, and it was becoming more international. So they were going to races like Surfers Paradise and other places around, a couple places around the world. And USAC and Tony George and the Holman family kind of felt like they were getting away from that that format of international racing. And not only that, some of the drivers' names weren't super recognizable, like Roberto Guerrero and Gilles de Ferran and a couple other guys, Marshall Guzman. Were a lot of the names you couldn't really say correctly, and it wasn't. And the international flair was kind of invading. It was not, well, it wasn't kind of, it was invading on the tradition of Indy being, an American race, and the kart series kind of moving away from what USAC did back in the. Because you got to remember nowadays a lot of the races are mostly road courses, and then there's an oval here and there. That's sort of what kart was, versus back in the 60s and 70s. Kart maybe ran on maybe Riverside or Laguna Seca, but they ran at Michigan, Atlanta, Charlotte, Texas, Nazareth, Phoenix. Phoenix came later, but places that were oval based. And if you weren't going around in a circle, then it was, most of the cars were mostly circle cars. They were only built to turn left or right, wherever the track was configured. And Tony George figured that's what they were getting away from, and also the speeds were starting to creep up as well. And that kind of came to a head in the 92 Indy 500, won by Alan Sir Jr., and I believe there was a lot of wrecks and a lot of injuries at the 92 Indy 500. So for 93, Tony George and the family decided to change the configuration of the brickyard. So back then, so from the start of the kart era, back in '78 all the way till '92, there were really no such things as warm-up lanes. There was really no separate area for the cars to warm up. The cars just came out on track and just ran. They run on the apron, but they had dedicated warm-up lanes so that they could get in and out of the pits without having trouble, and so that they could build up speed and stuff like that, and it was less dangerous this way. But what ended up happening was the drivers were lengthening the track, cutting into the corners and the apron, because there was no white line or rules back then, and they were speeding up the lap. The lap times were starting to fall. Not only that, the speeds were starting to go up because the cars were starting to push 230, 240 almost on the backstretch at Indy, and Tony George set up these lanes so that you couldn't pass or you couldn't run on these aprons and speed up the lap. So like 78 through like 92, there were multiple grooves to go through the lap. After that, there was multiple grooves. They went from multiple grooves to one groove, and passing had to be done on the straightaways at the Indy 500, so you needed more power. That's where the stock block cars came in, and that's when the speeds of the stock block cars, because Roberto Guerrero because I believe in 92 and 93, I believe there were Buicks and Maynards on the pole in the front row. Those were the cars that were doing 230, 231, 232. In fact, Roberto Guerrero had the track record at the time at 232 in 93, because he had the stock block. Now in 93 through some strategy and some calling, Emerson Fittipaldi won the 93 Indy 500, but it was very difficult to get through the field. So what Roger Penske wanted to do is he wanted to figure out how to do that. But first, for winning the Indy 500, um, for winning the Indy 500. And so in Phoenix, Arizona, the Mario Ilian. So one day, Mario Ilian between races, Mario Ilian and Paul Morgan and Roger Penske um, went to this ranch resort area in the middle of Arizona, and they were having an over dinner. They over a small lunch. They were discussing what they were going to do for 1994. So Roger started discussing. So the discussion. I've read the book. If you guys have read the book Beast, you'll know how the conversation sort of went. But I don't know if Jade Gerst quite did his research but so they were going over a casual dinner to kind of reward themselves with winning another Indy 500, and with the Chevrolet 265, although it was going to be Badge Ilmore Indy V8 in '94. Penske sort of proposed the idea of looking at he didn't have the rule book, but he had a couple of notes in his pocket, and he pulled out a pocket, and he started to talk to Mario and Paul, and he told Paul and Paul Morgan, Mario Ilian, we won another Indy 5. We won another Indy 500. I'm proposing to build a new engine for '94 so we can win. And he goes, I'm thinking of I took a look at the USAC rule book, and I'm thinking of building a stock block engine for Indy only. And he goes, and I think he went on to say something, and I think it was because it was a little too close, and it took a little too close in the way the speedway was configured. They needed more power, and they needed to, and Roger being Roger, he was always looking to look into the rule book and see what he could obviously use to his advantage, if you want to call it the unfair. If it wasn't more of a loophole, then it would be more of an unfair advantage type thing. So he looked at them, he explained what they needed and what the power output needed to be, and Mario Ilian and Paul Morgan, Ilian and Morgan basically said, "Yeah, we can do it." And he goes, "We've been partners for a long time," and they set up the deal right there. And contrary to everybody's stories, that Penske approached them when he was a shareholder, and when he was a shareholder and he had stake in the company, he didn't approach them. He was a partner in Ilmore, because obviously you're going to hold stock, and you're going to be part of the board slash businessman with the company that you're doing business with for your race engines. I mean, that'd be kind of silly, wouldn't it? He didn't approach Morgan and Ilian. He basically had them right there to talk to. He didn't have to phone them up, and they only had a few months to start really making this engine, because it was '93. I think it was June '93 that this started, and I think it was from June '93 all the way till March and December that they started to build the engine. And the engine, I'm not really going to get into the specifics of the engine, but let's just say that this thing was volatile. It turned over its own cylinders and its own cylinder head. And Roger told them that the car needed north of 900 horsepower, and it needed more than the 825 or the 825 850 that the Cosworths, and more than the 900 that the Buick Maynards were making, and just to make sure that the drawings and they listed it under a they listed it under the NASCAR plans, and NASCAR plans because Penske was running was running was running a was running the stock car back then with Rusty Wallace and a few other people, and he wanted to put it under the NASCAR plans and blueprints, and he labeled the engine the 265E. And even though it wasn't a 265E, the 265, it was supposed to differentiate. If they had put 3.34, it would have made it very obvious what they were doing. So, and work went on immediately, and they had to design the block. They had to put the blocks together, and the cars had to, and the engines had, the blocks had to be preheated, and they had to be done in a certain amount of time, so that the camshafts could fit, and the cylinders could fit, and if they didn't get it right, they had to redo it again. It was kind of a real messy thing, and then they had to test the engine, and I think they blew the doors off one of their engine dynamometers a few times. They had to latch the doors. This was done in the truck warehouse that he had in overnight too, and he had to make, and he would ask for updates for the engine power. At one point they had 900. Penske said that wasn't enough. And then eventually, when they got an AC Delco system, they were able to, versus a Zytec system, they were able to get almost 950 horsepower. And then with some more tuning, the car was almost making over 1,024, and that was quite a lot. And then they needed to test it. If you listen to the whole thing, you'll listen to the stories of Paul Tracy in February of '94 at Nazareth, basically testing it out and freezing his hands off and his toes off because of how bad the wind chill was, and they actually had to clear off Nazareth because it was snowing back then. And you know, they struggled to get this engine to be reliable, and Penske knew if he was able to get this thing to run 500 miles, he would own the race at the Indy 500. They really didn't get the whole thing until the day before. About a week before the race, with Alonso Jr. at the helm, and he did like 520 miles or something with it. And it was a proven car; he could do it. They just needed to make sure that the car was calibrated. They made sure they didn't do any wheel spin or anything, because this car broke half shafts. It broke cylinders. It broke tappets. It broke cam followers. It broke everything in order to do this, and they had to do everything they could to just get it, because they had to get the limit. And then eventually, you know, they had to test it. They obviously had to keep the speeds down. There was always talk of them keeping the speeds down because they didn't want the boost pressure change prior to the race, even though the guy who ran the whole rule book for USAC said he wouldn't have turned it down. He would have just let it race, because you know they weren't going to spoil them just because they wanted to see if it was going to run. You know, because it was just one of those things. So they ended up doing putting together that, and in between races, obviously Roger Penske. What was hilarious was even preseason, when the announcement was made at Long Beach, in April of '94. If you guys watch the '94 Long Beach broadcast, you'll notice them commenting, and Sam Posey even says, "Oh, they've exploited a loophole in the rules. This is a purpose-built Mercedes-Benz engine. They basically pulled the floor out, the rug underneath off the kart world and stuff like that." And to be honest, they did kind of pull a fast one on the automotive world and caught a lot of people by storm. But it was because the announcers were trying to make a big deal out of it, and they were trying to really highlight just how of an amazing feat this was. And they even mentioned the testing at Nazareth, with trying to clear the snow off. Everything that was detailed in that book, between everything between for that. And the '94 was a really big year because in the background, Tony George, at the beginning of at Surface Paradise and at the Indy Racing League was announced, and Tony George wanted to return that back to the ovals, and Tony George kept saying to the press, it's USAC and the kart championship have kind of alienated people, and it's too technical, and it's just not viable. And he wanted to make their cars more relevant to the old school cars, make them old fashioned. And for those of you who know how that went, the 90s, then they ended up using 96 95 cars and before to do that championship, and then eventually in '97 they eventually went to the 4-liter engines that sounded like NASCAR motors with over 700 horsepower. But that's a story for another time. So the stage was set for, and this was just and here's Penske with this Wonder motor that just before the event got sponsored by Mercedes. It was a Mercedes in name, but it was really no more Chevrolet design engine because it was an overhead valve, and last time I checked, Mercedes didn't do a lot of overhead valve engines. They were more of a sports car, do overhead cam, exotic. They weren't really push rod engine type manufacturer. And they had Mercedes money, so all this was boiling up to make it. And when they presented the cars at Indy, a lot of people were like, "Oh, okay, here's the car that's gonna blow us over." I mean, Nigel Mansell said the car had over 1,200 horsepower, and the car would be able to go 260 miles an hour on the banking. I mean, Nigel knows power when he sees it, because he used to drive Formula One cars that were 1,200 horsepower and 12,000 to 1,200 horsepower in Formula One in the first turbo era. So he knows power when he sees it. And when he heard the cars for the first time, a lot of people up and down the pit lane were like, "Oh crap!" But then everybody was like, "Wow, cars have to last the 500 miles," and only 2 cars have ever finished the. So practice went along. The car went. I think they turned the pop-off valve or sealed it, and Emerson went 251 on the backstretch, and the cars were doing 220, 229, 230. Even though Roger Penske told all 3 of his drivers, he told Paul Tracy, Emerson Fittipaldi, and Al Unser Jr. to keep the speeds down, because he didn't want the boost being turned down prior to the race, because USAC's regulators could turn down the boost down from the 55 to whatever they wanted to keep the cars competitive. And qualifying ended up being maybe one of the worst sandbagging things of all time. If you guys have watched the run with Al Unser Jr., he did a 225, 228, and 229. The car only did a pole 228, and probably some of the greatest sandbagging in the world. And they did that because they didn't want the boost turned down, and they didn't want to do 235s and stuff like that. Car was clearly capable of 235. In reality, it was great on the straightaways, but it was horrible in the corners because what ended up happening was they spent so much time on the motor. The PC23B chassis ended up not handling all that well. So the car was mega fast on the straights, but in the corners they were dragging their speeds down, and that sort of negated any advantage they had. If they spent some time in the chassis, they may have run away with things a little faster. For those of you who don't know, the race was basically a Mercedes affair. Not too. I think they may have had a spell of somebody else in the lead. I mean, Jacques Villeneuve, or Jacques Villeneuve, as Paul Page erroneously used to say, because he couldn't pronounce Jacques Villeneuve's name. Villeneuve. It was kind of. I think Tony George probably sat there and spoke. He goes, "Yeah, this is the reason why we can't." Because even our announcers can't even. Because I think he even made a point. I think he was like, even our announcers can't even get these guys right until like the second or third year. So he was kind of proven right. But so Penske ended up winning the race by the smallest of margins. I think Al Unser Jr. and Jacques Villeneuve were the only ones on the lead lap, not for domination, but just because of just the way how the race ended. And everybody was tense because during the last couple caution periods, they really didn't want the engine to. The pace laps were great and the caution periods were great, but they wanted to make sure that the engine wouldn't burst. And Paul Tracy ended up having, and the story goes, Paul Tracy ended up going out without a turbo. People were like, "Oh, the Mercedes is falling apart because the turbo's out," and blah 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 blah. And Bobby Anser's like, you know how Bobby Anser is, and he's like, "This Mercedes is fast." And so Mercedes is fast, you know. And then Paul Page and everything's like that, and then Emerson Fittipaldi, with I think it was like 20 laps to go, ended up crashing out because he got into the marbles, even though he already passed Al and he already had a lap on the field. There was a couple more cautions. Al ended up winning the race. It was his second victory in a row. And then the controversy started on how this engine should have been policed. And I think it was by Mid-Ohio that they reduced it down to 51 inches. And a lot of people call it a purpose-built engine, and a lot of people called it kind of a short. It was because these cars were engineered in a parameter, and Penske would have had to change the block. So Penske lost, I think it was, I forget what the number was. It was multiple millions of dollars on the whole setup, and he couldn't use the block because when he went to the Indy 500 next year, the engine would have only had 48 pounds of boost. That's only 3 more, and he didn't consider that anything but. And he ended up not making the Indy 500 in '95, which was the first in like eons. So I think since like the '70s he didn't make it. So yeah, people made a huge deal about it. Really didn't dominate in the way it does, but Indy didn't. But USAC and CART didn't really want it to. Didn't really want to have that sort of thing. If they could have sold those engines to multiple people, he might have made in the 20 turn quick back, which Penske wouldn't mind doing, because I'm going to say in 95, if they had the engine, they had the same engine, I think they might have, I think they might, if they perfected the engine, they perfected the chassis for the 220, for the PC24, it might have been easy, because Penske really didn't think that it was going to be all that successful in its first year. I mean, it was going to be win, but he didn't know by how much. So I think by 95, they would have really done well, and they would have really done well. But I think they just had the start block hangover happening on them. Alonso won the championship, and I think it was right around then Al started to have trouble in his personal life, because he didn't making the Indy 500 was a big thing in his family, and it was a shame that he didn't make it, because Al always made the field for the Indy 500 back then, and it was kind of a big thing for him, and he didn't really want to give that up, and that was kind of his motivation to kind of get up in the morning and stuff like that. But so the engine probably is, so the engine may have done more harm than good for somebody's livelihood. But so kind of to talk about it, did the engine break a loophole? Did it exploit the rule book? Did it really do damage to the racing world as we know it? It's up to everybody's interpretation. I think it was just an experiment. It wasn't really meant to be long-lived. I think Penske knew it. I think he knew it was a one-off deal, because to do it, and he thought if it was successful, maybe he would, but it got so much harsh criticism that it should have sparked, because I think what his intentions were to, if I want to say this, it goes back, it hardens back to USAC's old adage, because I think Penske was trying to embrace the idea that was trying to do that in order to embrace the idea that yes, we can run these engines, and yes, we can run these engines, and maybe we should run these engines. Maybe they're a little bit more production based. Maybe they're built so that it'll lower the cost, because over time they could have lowered the costs of these engines if they could mass produce them, and it could have brought USAC back to its roots of old school engineering, and drew it back to what it was back in the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, before the 265 and all the block and all the back to the early days when Ford was running with the Lotus Indy V8. And it's actually funny. The two Ilmor employees, Morgan and Mara Ilian, ended up working for Cosworth, because Cosworth was a portamao of Mike Costin and Keith Duckworth's name, who worked for Lotus, who was the big name in Formula One at the time. And then Ilmor, and then in the late 70s, early 80s, they ended up forming Ilmor, Ilian, Morgan, Ilmor, and they were working for maybe one of the best names of IndyCar racing at the time, Roger Penske. So it kind of, and that dynasty, thing is though, that dynasty for Lotus, well, not around too much longer, but Roger Penske's still kicking around and trying to win championships, but it kind of sunk. It kind of made, but it didn't go as intended, and I think it was more of a blatant showing off rather than a look at the future. and it could have kept things high tech. It could have kept things on the cutting edge, and the engines could have evolved into something bigger. But what's funny is they eventually would, in the late 90s, early 2000s, CART would eventually go into the Honda era, and then eventually when CART ended up dissolving in the early 2000s, the engines were Chevrolet and Honda and Toyota, and then eventually just went to Honda from 2004 all the way to 2011, and then we've got the production-based style, purpose-built engines of 2.2 liters, which, if you listen to the broadcast of the 94, the 94, the 1994 series, you will notice that Paul Page was talking about a purpose-built 2.2 liter engine. Didn't really announce how many cylinders it was, but they sort of, I think CART and IndyCar started to kind of foresee the future, and then of course we know, they went to a 4.0 crossplane V8, which sounded like 9,000 RPM, which sounded like a NASCAR stock car. And so, did it ruin the automotive landscape? I don't think so. I think it might have been more of an innovative, because I said, if they had developed it, and if they needed to tweak the power because the cars needed to be slowed down, they could have done that. They could have done that, and then they could have presented that to Tony George, like, oh, hey, this is a stock block. We can reduce the power, or we can do all this other stuff, and other manufacturers could do this, and we could. But as we know, it's a lot of people looked at it as an exploit of the rules, a loophole, because, as I said, it was not really meant for a big team like Roger Penske to run with. It was more for a team that didn't have a lot of cash and just had enough to buy a chassis and then lease an engine, because back then the USAC engines were, the IndyCar engines were leased from the manufacturers to the teams, and that kind of went against what that was, and they were paying. They could have actually done that with Penske with the stock block engine, but Penske paid out of his own pocket and out of his own interest to make this engine. Now, not to say that Gurney didn't do that with his own Westlake stock block back in the 60s and 70s, and Ford did with his own V8 Ford engine, but it was real in the Coyotes, but that was really just a Ford engine, because good old Ford like DJ, but big text. But it did ruin the automotive landscape, but I don't think it was really a loophole. I don't really think it was an exploit of the rules. He just read the rule book. He just spent a little bit more money than the little guy, and he had deeper pockets than guys that ran the Maynard and Buick engines. They were really meant for teams that could have just won it, but no one will really know what would have happened. But I think it might have, had they kept with it, it could have sparked, it could have been a standard engine, and cars could have been lower revving, and they could have done so, and we wouldn't have the dreary looking spec cars that we have today, and every car being different, and we only have one chassis, two engines, and we have a hybrid system because we have to make racing more appealing, I think in terms it kind of justified Tony George's view that it was getting too exotic and people were spending too much money, and it was kind of getting out of hand. I think you might have seen what Penske was trying to do. Maybe it was a lie just to keep things going, and I don't think I think he just had enough, and I think that engine really kind of showed it. So and then 95 on, obviously they obviously didn't qualify Indy, and they didn't have such a great season otherwise. It was just not great. And then eventually it just became Al Unser Jr. and Emerson Fittipaldi, because Paul Tracy would go to there's 95, 96. Paul Tracy would go off to Newman Haas Racing, and then in 97 I think he'd come back. So it really changed a lot of people's perspective on engines and how expensive it was getting, and how purpose-built cars, because it ended up ruining Roger Penske not making his own cars 1999 on, because he had to dip Penske cars, and he had to start with the Reynard chassis with the Honda engine, and it ended up being the magic combination that got him and Gilles de Ferran and Castroneves a couple championships, and eventually he had to join the Indy guys, and then the Indy Racing League, and then eventually we had the Honda and the Honda high rev and V8s, and then eventually we got into these boring cars, even though they've been livened up. So to answer your question, it's not a loophole. It was more of a genius move, but it was kind of a disrespectful approach to the rule book, and it was more of an unfair advantage move just to stake it to Tony George, and I don't think Tony George took it too well. So, and that's the reason why he wanted to boost the IRL. Not only that, 2 years after those mega engines, Art Leindeck ended up getting the track record at 230. Ended up getting the track record at 236.7 miles an hour at Indy, and that was faster than the stock block ever was going to be. And I think had the stock block kept improving, the car could have done 232. The car could have done 234, 236, 237, maybe even 240. But I think it was just getting too much for. And of course, Cart's having problems at the Lausitz ring with that, Scott Brayton dying, and then Greg Moore dying, of course. It all kind of just caved in on Cart, and I think it was just kind of the death spiral for Cart, just to have that engine, just to have USAC, one of USAC's ultimates, and then produce the engine, and then racing. So I don't think it was a loophole. It was more of it wasn't an exploitation of the rules. It was more of a liberal, unfair advantage taken with the rules. There were very many liberties taken with it, and the engine wasn't very kosher with what the rules were meant to be. So it was it was a very genius move, but I don't think it was very much of a loophole. But it was so much of a nuclear bomb in the automotive, the IndyCar world, that few people saw that as kind of in a way, and there's no way people would have spent all that kind of money in evolving the car, and that's the reason why CART would stay with the 265 engine regulations, and Indy the IRL and USAC would stay with the 4-liter naturally aspirated V8, which sounded like a NASCAR stock car. And then eventually they went more exotic, because obviously they wanted to go along with the times, and they wanted to kind of get rid of any reference to the stock block style, because I think Tony George kind of looked at it and he's like, I kind of want to just go with this, and it's like anything else. But yeah, I think it was just Roger Penske just spent too much money. He took a real look at the rules, took too many liberties, and he ended up I think he ended up killing kart's reputation, and then they had the 25-8 rule a couple of years after, and it just ended up being just a mess. So the engine, while very innovative and very genius, ended up killing the course of the Indy 500 altogether. So but I think that's up for everybody's interpretation, and it's the reason why a lot of people look upon him as just that one guy, because no one really gravitates towards him. It's nice to see him win, but after this season, it kind of wanted me to take a look at maybe, just maybe, that maybe that engine, maybe they would have been a little bit better. They're not winning every single season, because Alex Palou's pulled off a couple of victories, and then we've obviously had a few other people win the title since then. But Penske kind of has his moments where he'll win a championship, and then he won't win a championship. Ganassi will win one, and then he'll win one, and then another team like Andretti will win one, and then it'll rotate over again, because I think Ganassi's probably going to win this year. But I think it's everybody's subject, but I think it was just a little kind of brash for him to do that, and I could see where he was going with it. Maybe he was trying to make the cars more stock block. Like, if they used the stock block rules, maybe that could have been a thing for the Indy 500 to make it the biggest, fastest spectacle in racing. But Tony George didn't kind of see it that way, and I think his mind was already set. I think he already played his hand, and then Roger played his, and then I think that's what I think Roger kind of winning that and kind of sweeping that kind of told Tony George, well, maybe I want to cancel all this and kill Card and do whatever. And he did a very good job of kind of just saying to everybody, well, Card's killing people off left and right. No one's dying in my series, so I don't know who you're going to pick, but we're obviously going to be the safer one, because we're going slower, but we're obviously going slower, but we're safer, and you'll come home in one piece, and you'll be able to see your family and friends at the end of the day. So especially with all the accidents with Greg Moore, Scott Brayton, and Alex Zanardi losing his legs, so and plenty of hoi polloi accidents, and just one of those things. So, all right, I've been here for 47 minutes, but yeah, it's interesting to know that, yeah, it was kind of a liberty. They took a lot of liberties with the rule. It was kind of an unfair advantage, most likely. It didn't exploit the rules, because he read the rule book the way he should have, and the engine was made the way he should have. He just ended up having more money and was just able to use it to win them outright. He got the combination right, and I think that's what pissed a lot of people off. So he got the unfair advantage yet again, but I don't think it's a loophole. It's just he was able to just outsmart everybody. And one of the things he loved was, he said, well, I like to outsmart, I like to come up with solutions, outsmart everybody. It's what gets me going in the morning. He goes, like any other guy. So he goes, so like good music, a good car, nice girl, whatever. It's what got him going. It's what turned him on. So it was a good challenge. So he put effort in, and he got results. That was his motto: effort equals results. So, but yeah, we'll see you guys later. I'm gonna upload this now. I'll see you guys tomorrow night for a regular vlog. Because I thought I was gonna do this in 2 parts, but I'm just gonna 3 parts, but I'm just gonna do it in 2, because I've been here for about an hour. So peace out, everybody. See you guys later. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. And to the guy who commented, yes, I love IndyCar, and I like everything on open wheel style cars. It's amazing. So see you guys then, and I will catch you guys later.